I'd like to welcome everyone to e-flux tonight for a kind of schizophrenic book launch of two very recent books by Eyal Weizman, who we're really pleased to have here for the second time in three evenings. On Sunday night, he was here as part of a conference on the launch for a double issue of e-flux journal on architecture as intangible infrastructure, which was also guest edited by Nikolaus Hirsch. And tonight it is for these two books. One, the Conflict Shoreline, which is by Eyal and Fazal Sheikh, and is published by Steidl and Cabinet Books. And the second book is the Roundabout Revolutions, which is part of the Critical Spatial Practice series, edited by Nikolaus Hirsch and Markus Miessen, and published by Sternberg Press. So both books are on sale in the back, I believe. And I will. It's also a pleasure to have Nikolaus and Sina here, in conversation with Eyal. And I'll pass it to Nikolaus for
just very briefly.
A brief introduction.
Eyal mentioned or said he has a fear that people in New York are exhausted by your presence, because these days feel a bit like an Eyal Weizman festival. But I think it still makes sense a lot to listen to Eyal tonight, because Eyal usually needs to fully present his work, because I was at Columbia University last night. I think he needs 6 hours usually. So since no institution in New York is ready to give him 6 hours these days, one is almost forced to fragment his ideas, and the audience has to somehow put things together in its head. And therefore I'm really pleased that we have the opportunity tonight to get other bits and pieces of your thought, which doesn't mean that these bits and pieces are incoherent, hopefully.
Have you locked the doors, Brian?
The way we want to structure this evening is, as Brian said, we'll have two books, new books by Eyal Weizman, and we will start with the Conflict Shoreline, and after that, so the short presentation, followed by a discussion. Then we'll move to the Roundabout Revolutions, also with a short presentation and a discussion, which will be hopefully quite interesting to discuss.
Great.
Please, Eyal.
Thank you, Nikolaus. Thank you, Brian. Thanks for e-flux for tolerating me for yet another event. I don't know really how to do it. I guess I will start to speak about each one of the books, and you just have to unplug me when it's time for discussion, because there's really no way to describe each one of the books in 15 minutes. But I would like to speak in general and to start with the Conflict Shoreline. The book is actually titled The Conflict Shoreline, Colonization as Climate Change in the Negev Desert. And to start with a general point that I think it is somehow the key to understand what forensic architecture, the kind of counter-forensic agency I spoke about in the last event here, has been doing in relation to this subject. So the general point, I think, is that when scholars or activists of human rights are exposed now to issues of environmental transformations and climate change, we bring with us a certain sensitivity to things. And in particular, something that I think, maybe I'll replace it with this, because this feels a bit. In particular, hello, can you hear? So in particular, one thing, a category that is very important for those of us that research urban warfare, violation of human rights in urban environment, is that of the collateral damage. Collateral damage is obviously understood as that unintended consequences of an attempt to hit targets, military targets. So it's used in the context of warfare in saying we were trying to attack this and that military target, and civilian life has been lost, civilian property has been destroyed, and that is not our intended consequences. And in the human rights world, we understand, whenever we hear that something is a collateral damage, we become very suspicious, no? Because in particular, after many years of looking at situations of human rights violation, of urban warfare, we realize that urban warfare is a very political kind of conflict. It is not about occupying a place only. It is really about affecting a certain political reality on the ground. And that the political reality or the political effect of urban warfare is usually taking place through the killing of civilians and the destruction of civilian property. For example, at the end of the 2014 attack on Gaza, the kind of achievement that was mentioned by the Israeli military at the end of that conflict was something like that. Now the Hamas leaders would come out of the tunnels, they would see the enormous destruction we've brought on the Gaza Strip, the enormous death, etc. And they will think twice whether to start again. I.e., the killing of civilians is a deterrent. And that means that sometimes we need to invert these categories, the target and the collateral. Now, why am I mentioning that? I'm mentioning that because when I started to think about issues of climate change, environmental transformation, etc., it seemed to me that even the most militant activists, environmental activists, repeat that error. So when we speak about climate change, it is almost as if it is the collateral damage of history. It's the collateral damage of an attempt to industrialize, to create wealth for some or for many, of transportation, etc. And it is the emission of CO2 that is somehow the collateral effect of that, and shit happens. We did not intend the climate to change, but it has. Now, the thing is that when you become suspicious at that, you start looking for another history of climate change. And one of those that I've been somehow tuned to is to think about climate change from the point of view of colonial history. And if you do that, you see that from the 17th century onwards, climate change is thought as a project, not as a collateral of history, i.e., taking possession of the world, thinking of the earth as a design project, right? We're taking over, we colonize places, we try to affect the environment, we try to make what is warmer cooler, what is cold warmer, we try to make the unproductive land productive, right? And that requires a certain design intention. And these are very noticeable at what I call in the book environmental thresholds. And in particular, the threshold of the desert. So I'm trying to write in that book the history of a climatic condition, how that climatic condition enter into history. And it enters in two ways. On the one hand, there were attempts to define the threshold of the desert. And they go, and they are 100 years old, and I will not now go in detail into them. And the reason is that the threshold of the desert become a certain threshold of governance and a threshold of the law. In many colonial regimes, both the Ottoman and the Europeans that have taken over the Orient, and in other places also, it is really beyond the line that has been defined as the threshold of the desert, that a certain autonomy is granted to the people that are there. It is obviously perceived as a less productive area. There is no point in controlling it. It doesn't return the investment on it. So it is, we define it we grant it, we put it outside of the law to a certain extent, outside of politics. So how do we know where the desert begin? And then science enter into that debate at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, in various categories, in various scientific debates are being undertaken. And finally, I think what has been more or less established is that the desert begin with a line that connects all points where 200 millimeter per year rain is actually falling in these parts. And the reason is that it was perceived at the time, of course today we know it is not necessarily so, that the certain kind of species of cereals that were used at the time could not grow on a flat surface under 200 millimeter per year. So that line that connects all those points that were measuring 200 millimeter per year become a legal and political threshold, a certain edge of the law. Because they designate the end of productive land, it is not only a kind of a designation of a static thing, but there is continuous attempt to push at this line, right? That is what I would call to think of the earth and the kind of the politics and architecture of the earth itself. So all along the threshold of the desert, and think about, kind of a political equator, to use a term that Teddy Cruz has coined, a kind of a line that is rather wavy as it goes all around the earth. Colonial regimes are trying to push at this line using irrigation techniques and all sort of other things. Now, of course, desertification would push it on the other side. So we have two major forces that are affecting that line, and they're affecting it in an uneven way, and that's why the line of the desert is never straight. It is also responding, of course, to various other geographical singularities along it. So colonialism would push the desert, let's say in the northern hemisphere, southwards. Climate change would move it northwards. So what happened between the high tide and the low tide of that line? And that is the story that the book is dealing with. And the book has begun really by, at the moment when Fazal Sheikh has come to my place in London and showed me images of the desert. He has documented the desert rather systematically, flying over it since 2011, and has taken photographs of all sorts of things that are happening at the threshold of the desert, right? There were displacement of Bedouins at the time. There was building of, there was afforestation, Israeli afforestation. There was dump yards. There were all sorts of things that were going on in there. And somehow through those images, through interrogating those images, the story of that line emerges. Now, one of the things we often do at forensic architecture is that we look very specifically at particular points and try to analyze them as kind of singular conditions or singular moments, singular iteration of a condition that is much more prevalent. So, in fact, the story begins with that particular village. It's photographed by Fazal Sheikh of the village, the Bedouin Palestinian village of Al-Araqib that exists right where the Israeli government has drawn the 200 millimeter line. That village has been demolished 70 times. Bedouins are the only Palestinians that actually exercise the right of return from places they were evicted from during the Nakba. They return, the Israeli authorities destroyed, they return, the Israeli authorities destroyed, 70 cycles like that, until those people, as you see, moved inside a fenced-up part of an ancient cemetery that became somehow the main object around which the book somehow evolves. So the book is evolving around those graves and the history of this environmental threshold simultaneously. It is looking at simultaneously very close shot and a kind of a macro story, the history, the colonial history of the desert threshold. What you see around is plantation of a new forest. This is partially the Nuremberg forest, donated by that city in Germany in memory of other events. But these are planted on lands, on Bedouin lands, in order to displace those people. And this is how those displacements look like. This is a photograph by Sayah Hattori, a Bedouin activist, and in fact, one of the family that live here on that site. This is the cemetery you see. You see the Israeli police displacing. And what you see really at the background of this image is very important. You see a line of forest here behind. This is showing to us that we are 400 meters into the desert, right? It's a battle that happens into the desert. But of course, the line of those trees would move forward continuously, almost like in a kind of Macbethian fashion. No? The forest would come every year closer to those villages. Now, after more than 80 cycles of eviction, this is how it looks like. Everything else has been destroyed, and the Aturis are holding on to the threshold of the desert, really, with few mattresses under the single tree that is there. Now, a very different image that you see. You know, this is the killing of Foley. Of course, Foley here is masked. This is a photograph produced by Elliot Higgins, a kind of a very famous investigative blogger, who tried to understand from this image where that killing took place. Now, we know that image. We know the kind of the monochromatic power of the desert against which the yellow jumpsuit kind of was so clearly visible. How do you know where it is? In fact, there is a detail here behind that image. If you zoom into it, you see several green pixels at the background. And that shows us, again, we are not deep in the desert. We are at the threshold of the desert, and this is how he has discovered here at the outskirts of Al-Raqqa the actual location here in red spot where that assassination has taken place by comparing the topography, etc. Now, that threshold of the desert and Al-Raqib are on the same shoreline. And all along that shoreline, there are conflicts right now. All along it, there are conflicts of different nature. And I think that what I'm trying to do in that book, and when I say I think, because there's various things that happen in that book, but one of them really is trying to look to find a way to tell a story that is larger, that crosses the kind of the separate national histories that are separated by borders, by moving along the desert edge, really from Algeria, through the rest of North Africa, Libya, Egypt, through Gaza, the north of the Negev, going into Syria, Iraq, Iran, etc. What is happening in that moment of pressure between those two major forces, colonization pushing the desert south, climate change pushing the desert north? Somehow the line actually splinters and disintegrates. And in fact, here, this map shows that also, this is the very famous Heinrich Kippert map from the end of the 19th century. Trying to measure the threshold of the desert was really a task of many Orientalist travelers there. Now look at this map. This is the official Israeli Atlas of Israel map of precipitation across 48 Palestine, Israel, the West Bank, Gaza. You see that in the north, in the Galilee, it's about 800 millimeter per annum, and it goes down to 50 towards the south. But you see that across the 200 millimeter line, a certain threshold of blue becomes a certain gradient of blue, flips over to a gradient of yellows. So that line is the knife, right? It cuts through. Under that line, no indigenous land right has been given. All the land under it is under Israeli state control, and therefore everybody in there can be shifted around, right? And it means the Bedouins, and it means also that the state would put under that line all the stuff that you need to hide in a state.
So let's say Israel would have a nuclear reactor, it is there, right? All the polluted industry, an archipelago of prisons for refugees, for African refugees that come from another threshold of the desert, the kind of sub-Saharan threshold, are kept all there in a kind of desert, dry Siberia in the desert, right? So I'm going to take you with a series of images through Fazal Sheikh's images. Here you see all along that threshold. Here you see a settlement, Ma'ale Adumim, one of the biggest in the West Bank, and the Jahalin on the other side of the road. You see the kind of the different typologies, but all along the desert threshold, you would have layers of displacement. Another something that is very important in that book is the interpretation of the aerial images, both of Fazal Sheikh and historical ones. What you see here is at the threshold of the desert, the surface of the desert become like a photograph because it is imprinted itself with the kind of the history of its use. What you see in round circles are sires in Arabic. These are places where livestock are kept. When livestock are kept in places, they soil the ground, it becomes darker. When people are displaced and after one rainy season, it becomes a bit lighter. After 2 years, it becomes yet lighter, etc. What you see here is our series, iteration of displacement and return, displacement of return. And the surface of the desert is a good photographic surface because it conserves these signs, the bigger one for camels, etc. So you could start reading the aerial images as if they were photographs of photographs. Of course, afforestation, and you see here in Fazal's image how a certain plantation of the Ambassador Forest is built really over a ruin of a Bedouin home that we later found in the old images. Just to mention another thing, at the time or just before we've undertaken that study, Forensic Architecture did a work for the UN and the Bureau of Investigative Journalism about drone strikes. And we had a kind of a map of drone strikes. And we wanted to map drone strikes against meteorological data. And when we saw it, it was incredibly shocking because not almost, but in fact all drone strikes, military drone strikes that take place right now happen in that environmental threshold, at the threshold of the desert, all across, both in the sub-Saharan area band and in the North Sahara aridity line, and this is something that make us understand very clearly that in fact drone strikes are a way to combat desertification. It was a joke. Here we were working with other material, a kind of an NDVI that would show you vegetation robustness. An image by Jamin van der Hoek, a NASA fellow that has actually produced it for us. The spectrum of green shows you healthy vegetation. The spectrum of yellow to orange shows you a gradient of dryness. And you see how politics and vegetation start interacting in this image. You see here very clearly the border between the Negev, the Nakab, and the Egyptian border. And you see that there's a little bit more vegetation, but along a very clear line on the Israeli side. That means that people were cleansed from there, that there is no pastoral economy. There are no goats eating those weeds. Therefore, natural vegetation has rebounded, but not on the other side. I'll just run through Fazal images rather quickly to show you all the sort of polluting industries. I mean, look at that in that dump yard. I think that's something that is very familiar to you from the U.S. context. A informal Bedouin community built really at the edge of a dump site, etc. This is Nouri Al-Ukbi, the person that in fact had led a kind of a one-man NGO that has led a series of land claims, a landmark land claim. He wanted to be something like the Mabu case in Australia, no? The case that undid the terra nullius kind of doctrine there. He was fighting for Bedouin land rights, collected an enormous archive that we present in this book of land deeds. Something that was incredibly important in this book was to show Bedouin presence in the desert in 3 different periods that were legally important for the case. The first one was around the middle of the 19th century, where the land law, the Ottoman land law, has been established to say wherever people cultivated land, they own it. And that started a kind of a process of critical reading of Orientalist literature. In this case, Henry Palmer, one of the most wacko of Orientalist travelers through Palestine, and somebody that really, like others, has seen the desert or Palestine as a text to be read, as a biblical text to be read, and in fact, throughout, kind of claims that he has seen no Bedouins, and that the narrative is a narrative of desolation, and that required salvation. In fact, what we've done was very simple. We've taken the contemporary map, and we've taken the same trip that Palmer. We tried to find exactly where he was in relation, in place, mapping exactly the bends in the streams that he was narrating, the hills, etc., locating ourselves in it, and also looking at the meteorological record. So the Ottoman Empire, after the Crimean War, started collecting meteorological data, and we realized actually that the desert that he describes, and the fact that there are no Bedouins, he described there are no Bedouins in this area, is a result of a 1 year in which there was incredibly severe drought in the area. But nobody read that book in relation or against meteorological data, so we were able to do that. We were also looking at military records that became very interesting, because on that site of the graveyard, here is the place of the graveyard, there were one of the biggest battles in the First World War, an Australian charge was held against the Ottoman defenses. The Ottomans, of course, fortified along the threshold of the desert, drawing the expeditionary force, the European expeditionary force, deeper and deeper and deeper into the desert, hoping to do what the Tsar has done to Napoleon or Stalin to the Wehrmacht, drawing them into the desert, drying them and keeping the fortification line on the wetter side of it. But that allowed a lot of material. For example, this is something that an image of an Australian cavalier, a command for a charge that we found in the archives. They were taking the picture, telling them where to charge. In the foreground, they would put somewhere to orient the soldiers, and what they've photographed is a well. So you read it against what it was actually meant to convey. We were looking at the Bavarian Air Force images, photographing for the Ottoman, and always at the threshold, at the edge of the parallax distortion of the camera, we were finding very small traces that needed to be huge enlargements of Bedouin presence in those military documents. Some of them almost abstract. They need to be so big. Really, at the molecular level of the film itself, there was also this British photograph that was taken in 1945, still in the Second World War, in which we kind of looked at it in enormous detail. Kind of think about photographers, architects, artists, looking very carefully to find traces that are extremely small within those images. And of course, the main question was the symmetry. Was the symmetry there before the state was there? So, for example, things like that, we could locate wells that we saw on the image, on a British photograph. We could locate them on the ground. And here the Israeli, this is a document by an organization that works with the Israeli state that tried to read them out of the image. They say they were not there before the state was established. And looking at the old graves, there was simply kind of a pile of stones. And zooming into the image, we realized, and this is something we take enormous care and detail in explaining in the book, that the size of the grave was exactly the same size of the single silver salt grain on the image itself. When we think that photography kind of resolved the question of the white part of the map that existed throughout colonialism, those areas that are not drawn and therefore people are displaced in, they persist also in photographic records. You just need to know how to read. You can read things out of an image and you could read things back into the image. Thank you. First book, done. Second book, though.
Oh.
Oh, sorry.
What do you want to do?
No.
Should we? Yeah. I'll ask a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up, and then, is that right? Is that what you want? Okay. So one thing that you talked about, Eyal, was the afforestation that's going on, and then a pushback from climate change that's happening. And that sounded like the climate change that we think about in a generic sense of things, desertification happening. But in the book, you also lay out the mechanism for the very way in which the afforestation produces the conditions for desertification, right?
Yeah.
Not as two independent processes that meet, but in fact, afforestation produces its own withdrawal, or the conditions for its withdrawal. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, because it's even more complex how this plays out.
So I think the kind of the relation between forest and climate change was apparent already since the 17th century. And initial attempts to irrigate the Western desert were proposed by American agronomists and colonialists by burning the forests of the Midwest so that clouds would be produced and the desert would become. So this I think kind of manipulating forests is not only kind of either the loss of the forest or a gain of the forest, but they're perceived as part of a much wider kind of cycle of designing the earth, right? Designing the environment, designing the climate of the earth. They have more meaning than local. When Herzl, right, kind of the father of Zionism, fretted about the fact that how is he going to get the Ashkenazis back into an area that is too dry and too hot. Warburg, one of the deputy and later the next leader of the World Zionist Congress, promised him that with specific form of plantation, he could reduce the temperature by 5 degrees and increase precipitation and make the area a bit more European. In fact, the European colonizers the Orientalist travelers that went and mapped the desert saw climate change as a project also in a different way. They thought, or they talked about the Arabs not as the sons of the desert, but as the fathers of the desert, right? The Arab occupation of the 7th, and then the Arab kingdom of the 10th century onwards, was seen as agents of desertification. The Arabs neglected it. The Arab desertified. They let the desert progress further up in Palestine. Therefore, the Europeans coming back. Sort of the climate change as kind of making the desert green, making the desert bloom. By the way, not only a Ben Gurion statement, but one that was employed in Mussolini in northern Libya as he was pushing the line of cultivation and the Cyrenician Bedouins back into the Sahara, was seen as a return of the, let's say, more natural condition of the environment at this time. So afforestation and climate are connected, but beyond the sort of the local effect, beyond the fact that now it's green, we have shade, or we have a place with forest. And the kind of the imagery and the ideology of forest is taken on very profoundly by Zionism, that kind of sees the return as the Jewish return to Palestine as a return of the biblical weather, and as the return of the form of previous kind of flora of the area. And that was the claim. If you come back, you bring it back, you bring the weather back with you, right? Like you say, oh, you brought the weather from London, no? When I land in Israel.
I have one more question, then we'll open it up. This is a question about a lot of the book, and it's fantastic, takes up transcripts from a particular, I have something actually, takes up transcripts from the trial that the particular person you saw is involved in. And he's amassed all kinds of documents, 19th century travelogues, all kinds of aerial photographs. A lot of the same kinds of documents you have here have been gathered by the guy, the one-man NGO, to try and go to the court to prove that his family has been there for many, many years, predating the state of Israel. And he's very confident about his case, it seems. And he goes, when this book went to print, he had lost the first case, and there was an appeal that was going to the Supreme Court, and it was being contested, in fact, in the Supreme Court. We didn't know what the status of that case would be when this book went to press. We now know that he lost, right? And the book itself is also being used as a document for a particular, maybe you can quickly tell us about that, and then I'll come back to the question. Yeah. But you also use the book in a very particular way as a document, right, for Zochrot?
So Zochrot is a feminist anti-colonialist organization based in Tel Aviv that kind of, its case is to return to a particular, use memory in a very particular way. It's not really don't have the time now to describe the sort of intricate methodology that they use to bring the kind of the history of the Nakba and Palestinian presence in Palestine to the consciousness of Israeli society. And it was before the case was lost, but it was a kind of an opening of an alternative forum that they call the Truth Commission on the Negev Bedouins. And I think that, at least from our point of view, forensis, which is the kind of the name, how we name our practice, is the kind of the counter-forensic practices are never surrendering into one forum, right? If we use a juridical forum, it is after a lot of self-doubt and asking ourselves, and also Nuri al-Ukbi asked himself the very obvious: if you enter an Israeli court and appeal against the state in the name of the law that is already the colonial law, what do? Do you actually justify the law? I think that al-Ukbi response to that was to think that, first of all, to be optimistic,
right,
which is a very rare kind of commodity in the area. But he felt that he had enough evidence to actually transform the law. So the idea is not only to respond to a given law, but to arrive at a tipping point, such as the model of Oren Iftachel, the great Israeli researcher that was doing most of this archival work, was to make the Israeli Mabu case, the case, the landmark case that would transform it. Of course, they were thrown from all the stairs. And now the existing forums are forums of activism, of politics. This book is in fact a report. It's a report for the Truth Commission, and it's going to be presented in the Negev on the last day of 2015 in a kind of forum that we want to build there on the site of those displacements. We're going to build a series of tensile structures there in which the Truth Commission is happening. And the reason we're doing it on New Year's Eve is because we want at least 72 hours that it would stand until the bulldozers come. And we kind of bank on them partying and letting us have at least the 72 hours.
So I wanted to ask, first, the detailed reading of the court cases is, incredibly amazing to read, because I'm an editor and I look at some of the ways in which Michael Svard, is that his name? Yeah. Michael Svard? Who's the lawyer who's representing the Bedouins, takes the testimony given by the experts brought by the Israeli government and just reads them so carefully, so beautifully, and dissects them. And for example, my favorite bit is a point where, I can't remember her name, Helen something? No. The person who's... Ruth Knark, right? Yeah. Is that her name? Yeah. She's brought in, and she's quoting an earlier text of herself in order to support the case that the Bedouins have no claim to the land. And she's got ellipses in her written testimony. She has some 3 little dots. And Michael Svard says, now listen, in the little ellipses that you have here, there's something you've taken out. And this little bit is your own earlier text from decades earlier, I think, where you talk about the amazing ways in which the Bedouins were irrigating this land. And how come it's missing here? So anyway, the court cases are at this level of forensic detail, and they're really wonderful to read. But one of my questions, I guess, was, armed with all this, armed with an amazing person like Michael Svard, the case was lost, the appeal was lost. And you also say that this is a quote, through the court, Al-Ukbi was seeking to address the Israeli public domain, which he believed naively perhaps would be able to see and reverse the injustice done to him. So there's a kind of a double gaze of the court itself, a public domain, but then also articles about the court case, et cetera, that would be mobilized, which it did do. There were, as you said, many articles. And I have a question, I don't even know how to frame it, as around the optimism that you would have in 2010, 2013, 2015, when you're a Bedouin and have had this long history of going to the very courts that have mandated again and again the dispossession of the land. And how does that work, that kind of question of going to the courts? What's the stake? What's possible? What's to be gained from it? Tell me how that works.
Well, obviously, the Bedouins take the long view. But it's also very essential to understand the sort of complex position of Bedouin people in relation to the rest of the Palestinian society and to the Israeli society. So those are citizens. These are the survivors of the great expulsion that happened in the 50s of Bedouins. And those that remain are the most vulnerable community in Israel. And they have been, the state used the kind of history of conflict between Bedouins and Falahs, the farmers to the north, to recruit, conscript the Bedouins into the army. And they see themselves somehow, kind of, he appeals to Israeli decency. He still believes in it. He says, I was in the army, my family was there. No, I mean, we kind of risked our lives for the state.
Herzl, I think, in his, right?
His father was a judge in a traditional court and had a Herzl photograph there. So it is exactly that position that allowed them also to be the most effective agents, or one of the most effective agents from inside. Bedouins are the only Palestinians that actually exercise the right of return. They come back and again to those places. Another thing is that those court cases are moments in time that kind of create an incredibly complex constellation of actors around them, an enormous catalyst of research. So volunteers of various forms, everybody's collecting research. So we were looking at the aerial images, kind of, and the archive against it. But there's a lot of collection and cataloging of traditional documents that is happening and they're there. They're still around. the case is lost. Of course, the Truth Commission is not going to have a transformative, immediate transformative effect. But it's an idea of writing the history. And I think that I agree with the Lukby that the case created also a certain community of practice. And at some point in the case, Lukby says, that is a case of a tribe against the state. People ask him, who is the tribe? And then he was showing those activists that were helping him, right? Oren Iftachel, Chaya Noach, Hoda Amar, who was there. Mm-hmm. So the tribe is not an ethnic, but a political kind of community that has emerged.
Would you argue in that sense that you did not only reconstruct history, but you also construct or initiate new histories in that case? Because I'm quite interested in this relation that you describe in the book between mapping or making maps and designing. So, because one could read the book as something that really tries to reconstruct the past and all the design processes that lie within mapping. But I wonder whether you are also among those who also write new histories, or maybe the Bedouins also use the reconstruction in order to construct something new.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that mapping something is not documenting a reality, but creating a reality. So, for example, when the Israelis draw this line, they say that's where the desert begins. All right, that's where the desert will begin. I mean, it will start shaping realities on the ground. No? The map would start to interfere. There is a kind of a topological relation with the map and the surface, no, of the earth. And it works also the other way around. If you read people, the idea is to read people back into the image, right? There is there is two thresholds operating in this book. There is a threshold of the desert, and there's the threshold of detectability, and they're related to each other. The threshold of detectability is how small an object could actually be registered on a single silver salt grain on the emulsion of the film. If you can, people cannot be registered from those aerial images. What are those things that are at the threshold, really on this line? And that is roughly the scale of a well, the scale of a grave, etc. But you need to read it back in to the image. And the hope was that reading things back into the image would affect future possibilities of inhabiting, of owning, of reversing. Of course, we are in such a desperate situation. And in fact, it's such a desperate book. I mean, I cannot claim for anything. I mean, I'd be at pain to start explaining something optimistic about it. The situation since the book has been written is just becoming worse and worse. There's more violence, more displacement. There is still these communities that try to resist it, but they've been brushed aside by a kind of conflict that does not get the same level of attention as the more kind of kinetic violence of Israeli occupation. No? The blast is more visible. These are slow processes. They're 100 years long. They're to do with afforestation and desertification. They're to do with the ebb and flow of the desert. And every time the desert, if you look at this, I know this area so well. I've lived in this part. I know it looks very different in the winter than the summer. In the winter, the greens start crawling down gradually, and then in the summer, slowly it kind of moves up. And every time that line ebbs and flows, it reveals another layer of history of displacement. And the process, the direction of the process is continuous displacement, not its reversal.
Should we open up to a couple of questions? Do you want a mic? Would you like a mic?
Thanks for the talk about the first book. so we'll see the second one. But I wanted to bring to your attention an interesting example that's kind of like a little bit, not reverses what you said, but just like open up another dimension. And that is the case of what's happening on the borders of Iran and Iraq. As a result of bombings and the loss of central government and all the other problems that came with the war, the palm forests are disappearing. And it's causing a phenomenon in Western Iran never seen before, which are these sandstorms, causing people to move out of areas because these are actually health-threatening, like asthma's going off the roof in certain cities, even cancers because of the existence of chemical agents in these dust because of the bombings, like depleted uranium, all sorts of stuff coming over, right? And basically, desertification that's happening in Iraq, even though with the photograph on the Iranian side is green, but it's a different type of green. It's a kind of green that is not really green. It's like a yellow that still the cameras don't pick up. It's not really green.
As green as possible.
Yeah. So basically, that you can consider a kind of colonialism that's actually increasing the desertification, right? In two ways, not just one, right? Literal desertification of palm forest, and also like the kind of like impact it has on the Iranian side. And also the interesting point is that Iranian government uses this in negotiation with the US to like always threaten to bring this up and ask for damages in international tribunals, and they use it as a bargaining chip whenever they get a chance to talk to America. Because they kind of say, if like they basically use this fact that like we're impacted by your invasion of Iraq in environmental ways, and they try to use that to gain sort of like advantages from the United States.
No, I mean, I think it's a very good example. The conflict shoreline articulates different types. There's different types of conflict all along it, and there's obviously the story of what contributed to the Syrian civil war was the drought along the kind of the desertification along that line, etc. So, I mean, the book kind of includes various examples along it, but this is a kind of an ongoing project that I now undertake with Eduardo Cadav and Paulo Tavares at Princeton, and we are looking at those. We're trying to look critically at those environmental thresholds, not only that of the desert, but that of the rainforest that operates the same way, only the opposite. The line of too much rain, where the forest is too thick. No, this is in the work of Paulo Tavares, has been defined as that outside of the law. Right, and the kind of the attempt to continuously claw at it, no, to create the savannas in the tropics. I think we need to move to no.
Yeah, maybe.
One more question or no? No.
There is
one
one
more
let's
question.
have
One more question. You have a question again. Brian has a question. Oh, okay.
In the climate change as colonialism, or as like kind of like this like civilizing mission, it seems like now there's this kind of like double action where there's that like the Zionist idea of making the desert bloom and the advancing of the kind of like the green temperate zone of European culture, which the Jews actually bring with them. These people who were always like a big part of the European project, but always these kind of internal foreigners who were often tasked with the hard work of building the culture in these kind of rough ways. And then on the other hand, there's this kind of like global level. It's actually the consumption of fossil fuels and the carbon emission of the industrialized West, which is then cast as kind of like driving the global process. And so is there this like weird kind of like playing out in climate terms of this like misery of the Middle East, where both sides of European problems and the Europeans fighting themselves or kind of working out their own issues on somebody else's land are here like played out again, where even though the oil comes from the Arabian Peninsula, it's pumped and burned to drive on the kind of west, you know?
Yeah, I think that there is the various, when you look at the kind of debate about the Anthropocene, you have those two models to think about when did the Anthropocene, the kind of the geological era of man begin. You know, there was a hypothesis proposed around the year 2000 by Paul Kurtzen that we are in a new geological era. But the question is, when did it begin? And Kurtzen proposed the steam engine, i.e. fossil fuels are industrialization is the beginning of kind of the tipping point in climate change. But there are other stories and histories, and the most somehow interesting one that just in March was kind of published was by Maslin and Lewis from the UK, two scientists, who actually said, in fact, the geological era of man began with a colonial encounter. And how did that work? It worked through smallpox. Europeans brought smallpox to the Americas, decimated the most part of the population. North America and Central America become reforested. Whole areas that they were deforested came back into forests. They absorbed an enormous amount of CO2 from the atmosphere, led to what is called the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age is associated with religious wars in Europe. It is associated as part of the causal field of the French Revolution, etc. We're now seeing that this is one example. There are others in which the role of agriculture and cultivation is taking a much more prominent place in the story of environmental transformation. And I think that what that book about the threshold of the desert is really aligning itself with these sensibilities.
Okay. Now we are very curious.
Okay, now you're curious. Well, it's related to a question that I had the other night, which I remembered when you mentioned that the Conflict Shoreline began as a part of a court case. So it is a kind of it actually came together as a production of evidence for a trial, right? So this. So it made me think of something else that you were talking about at the conference on Sunday, where which maybe is almost like another kind of desertification, where you are producing evidence against denial, right? I don't know if we could equate denial to desertification, but where you have a kind of an intentional emptying out. In this case, it was in the case you described on Sunday, it was the use of one-ton bombs by Israel, right? And so there's a court case, and you produce, you called it high-quality evidence to argue, right? To argue, to show that this event took place, right? That this is that there are the marks on the territory of something having happened. So my question is then, well, I mean, it's a very interesting. It's also a very interesting question next to the question of climate change, right? Because of course there's always this kind of humanist idea, right? That if something is being denied, this is almost implicit in the claims of human rights organizations, right? That if it is denied that this thing happened, right? So if you know that it happened, if you have a your humanist intentions can be enough to actually supersede the denial of Israel's denial of having used weapons, right? You know that it happened, but juridically, in the actual commodity system of law, we could say that actually if Israel says that something did not happen, it really did not happen, right? So the scale of argumentation, how convincing it has to be in order to say that something happened when a body this strong and this powerful says that nothing happened. How do you do it?
No, I think that I need to say that my field is architectural research, or architectural history. What we're showing in all those cases are historical methods, but they are in excess of that, because we seek for the history of one moment, or reconstruction of one shooting, of one day in Gaza, or of 300 years along the threshold of the desert, to be presented in different forums. No? So, and that comes against the idea that state violence is, as I said last time, it is both a violence against people and things, it's a violence against the evidence that violence has taken place. So there is a way to look at denial as a rhetorical annex, supplement to an action. But this is not how we regard it. We think that denial is integral to practice, to forms of practice. You bomb in a particular way because that's your way both to kill and to hide the fact that you're bombing. And hiding that fact of your action is an enabling condition for violence to keep on being perpetrated, right? So denial is a form of practice that is to do with not only with saying, oh, I didn't do it, right? But with, very specific choice of technologies, of resolution, of reading materials, of using particular histories and not others. As you would read in this book, there's like Sina said, there's a great kind of discussion in enormous detail of all the mechanisms of denial and how they operate. Now, it is very important to understand that denial operates, and it's the same, the kind of the enabling denial on which rests the project of colonization in Palestine. It's the same denial that denies the Nakba, that denies the fact that Bedouins were there, that denies that they've killed a child on Nakba Day, right? Because violence operates on these multiple scales. And I think that this investigation sits at the end of a kind of a scalar sequence that forensic architecture was dealing with. No, I mean an analysis of the bullet and a particular incident of shooting a day, 300 years, as I said before, and in all of them, we need to use different techniques to enter into the mechanism of denial, which is a form of practice, in order to at least dismantle it, or attempt to act towards dismantling. I think that's it's a bad term to say dismantling. We're far away from dismantling anything, but there's a trajectory, and there is an intention, and this is what drives us.
Roundabout.
Do we have time?
No, but
They're
go
here
on.
to hear about the roundabout.
So the second book has got nothing to do with the first. The second is my somehow response to my very good friend Nikolaus Hirsch, who has invited me back in 2012 to build something. And I go like, listen, there's no chance. I mean, no. And, you know, and I said, let's, you know, anyway, back and forth, kind of dragged me into this project to build a permanent folly in Gwangju, South Korea. And that is the story of this book, the story of my attempt to evade the task of having to design, and unsuccessfully, because there is a design project at the end. And that book is, in fact, started to be written with the commission. When Nikolaus brought me there, as he brought the other architects he forced to build, he showed us this image. In fact, this is the kind of image that everybody is seeing when we go to Gwangju. It's just struck me as absolutely incredible. This image is taken at the spring of 1980 at Gwangju, and it is the moment of the Gwangju uprising. Very important moment in the history of South Korea. It did not succeed in creating the kind of the revolution it tried to do, but perhaps it was the beginning that led 7 years later to the democratization of South Korea. But that image, I thought, had something modern and archaic in it simultaneously. There's an incredible power in the organization of people in this roundabout. The crowd is exposed to itself, right? It's a political community in becoming. And of course, seeing that image that kind of emanates hypnotic power on both on the people there and on everybody looks at it, appeared to me as the beginning of thinking about a folly. So, you know, Nikolaus said, build a folly. I think you all know what a folly is. Those kind of willful, playful, useless bits of architecture that are kind of an attack on use, in fact. And I thought that is a great folly, because it speaks about deactivation. So it's not about use and uselessness, but deactivating a space, taking a roundabout at the center of the city and kind of inhabiting it in this particular way, with this enormous graphic power. And of course, it was the time, 2012, it was just a year after this. And I thought that, so this resonated in my mind. Not only that, there were other roundabouts I'll show you later, that in fact, a question, what is the relation between a roundabout and a revolution? Simple thing. So I decided to write a book about the history of the roundabout as a traffic instrument, and to write the architectural history of the roundabout, but also to write into it the political history of the roundabout. So two histories that are entangled: the history of its use and the history of its abuse. The activation, what it activates, and its deactivation. So we don't have much time. We'd have to really dash through it. These are images of the Gwangju uprising that in fact was crushed on the very same day that the commune was overrun at Père Lachaise Cemetery in 1871. That's May 17th. They were both crashed on the same day. And here, these are all the other Tahrir Square, Al-Manara, the Pearl Roundabout, Azadi, etc. All the roundabouts that were center of roundabouts. So why roundabouts? After all, they're just a banal utilitarian instrument of traffic arrangement, and certainly not prone to induce any revolutionary feelings. But I started with the assumption that roundabouts for very practical reasons, are at the center of intersection. In order to put the city under siege, you no longer need to build a wall around it, but you can deactivate a place within it that would send shockwave throughout and paralyze, right? Put the city under siege by taking one point. Also, the circle is different than the square. The square is where the state or state planners provide place for gathering. So the state tells you, you could gather here. The roundabout is where they tell you, you cannot gather, right? It is cut away. The center of the roundabout is cut away from the city by a wall of speed. So there's a kind of an inversion that becomes necessary. Okay, there's other reasons, but we'll go through it. So the history of the roundabout. In fact, I was surprised. I thought the roundabout were always there, right? Because there's always round things in cities, but they were not roundabouts. A roundabout is not only a round thing in the middle of the road, but it's the rules for its use, right? So it's a physical instrument and set of regulations on top of it. The roundabout is the 20th century answer to a problem raised by the 19th century. So 19th century, big urban redevelopment, create boulevards, straight routes through the urban fabric. The 20th century has the car from the very start. The movement along those boulevards accelerates, and a problem starts emerging at the intersection. Traffic jams, accidents, problems. Paris, London, those cities become completely blocked. But in fact, the roundabout emerges as a kind of a set of experiments between three planners in three different places. There's William Phelps Eno in the US with the first roundabout built, in fact, in this city, in Columbus Circle. There is Hénard in France with the Étoile. And there is obviously the roundabouts of the Garden City later. So it's a discussion between suburban and urban. Right? When it's in Britain, it's invented as almost like the vernacular of suburbia. What is interesting, so this is Hénard's plans for the roundabout. Supposedly they did not know of each other. They all came up with that in the very same year. Only it is Raymond Unwin and Richard Parker that actually kind of, sort of give the credit to Hénard for their roundabout in Letchworth, Garden City. What is interesting for me about the roundabout, that it emerges when you read the discussion about it, and I don't want to bore you too much, it is really emerging as the translation of the philosophy of liberalism into traffic law. So at the time when kind of the height of liberalism, why? It's a question of taking the state out of the intersection, right? So this is how intersections were looked before. There's like this hilarious, this is also a kind of a proposal by Eno, a policeman at the center. In some intersection, there was as many as 24 policemen trying to regulate that. The idea that people can regulate, can self-correct, could learn, adjust by themselves. So it's somehow, the roundabout is a kind of a comic, in a way, a certain comic demonstration of Foucault's idea of governmentality, right? I mean, I'm not taking it too seriously, but in governmentality, there is a certain freedom, a certain withdrawal of the state within strict regulatory framework, no? So the roundabout is a circle in which you need to know how to navigate, you need to know how to correct, and the idea of all those people that write about the roundabout is that people are best positioned to regulate themselves without the state, right? So this is how it emerges. This, oh my God. Hi. Wonderful. So the roundabout is a physical thing, and the its modes of regulation, right? So now something occurs with that kind of translation of this liberal idea when it moves to the colonies. So starting in effectively after the European kind of occupation of the Orient, that roundabouts started appearing in French cities in North Africa, in British-managed cities in across the Middle East, etc. But the roundabout no longer becomes a kind of an instrument of liberalism, but start somehow manifesting the totalitarian power of the colonial state. And this is manifested by kind of things that are put right at the center of it. I'll move very fast through it. In Tahrir Square, etc., there's always the kind of the statue of the king that is promised to be built at the middle of it. So the question is how the apparatus that was coming to, and so the roundabouts are being put into the Oriental city, trying to discipline it and regulate it. And the question is how that instrument that come to discipline and control become the locus of the undoing of those very regimes, because all those demonstrations were happening within roundabouts. So, okay, we're totally out of time. I'll just really go through the kind of the series of roundabout revolutions that happen, as you see here in Tahrir Square, in Manara, this is in Ramallah, in Manama, Bahrain, somehow responding to each other, right? Creating a kind of a temporary extraterritorial zone. This is a manual of how to take over a roundabout. Here we're back in Istanbul, Manama. So you saw that before. And what is interesting about the Bahraini response is that they kind of understand that theory. They effectively, after the Bahraini revolution was crashed, they destroy the center of the roundabout and turn it into an intersection. I think this is really a kind of an idea of exercising, right? Trying to exercise the political power of the roundabout by creating that intersection. Okay, so let's end this part of the second book with this image that actually quite moved me. It was sent to me by a friend who visited Palestine. And what you see here is a roundabout, the promise of a revolution, and you see the wall. And the question is, when is the revolution going to come here that would tear down this wall? The book also speculates about other kind of round forms. And this another kind of hypnotic space, a kind of a diagram of power, a diagram of discussion, a crowd exposed to itself, is the very famous Solidarnosc round table that happened in April 1989. And somehow that table is credited with being part of the causal forces that brought down the Soviet bloc, right? I mean, this is the beginning of it. There is a fabulous documentary about a carpenter that got a commission to build it, and continuously is told to include more people or less people in there, and kind of is cursing as he has to build a Biedermeier style table, continuously readjusted. But he managed, and this is the that kind of very powerful diagram of forces. So I said, Nikolaus forced me to build, and what I've done is really a kind of a political thesis in built form, a relation between the roundabout and the round table, the necessity of immanent power of people in the street, and the necessities of government that was somehow lacking in many of those Arab Spring situation where political organization was often lacking. I mean, there's a longer discussion of that in the book. So a relation between the roundabout and the round table that was built, a pavilion that was built around a round table. At the center of this round table were two cameras. And the mechanism of discussion was this handle that was rotated around the center axis, producing a kind of a continuous record of the discussion in which everybody is both a filmmaker and being filmed. This, I just do not know how they ever allowed it in Gwangju. That's one of Nikolaus's miracles. At the site, one of the sites of the revolution, we were allowed to use the kind of paint that they're using to make street signs, to draw all the roundabouts in which revolutions occurred, from Ramallah to Azadi, through Tahrir, etc. These are these circles that you see here. But they're built in that kind of paint that when it rains, they disappear, because it's exactly become the same color as the street. And there is about, 250 days of rain there. So it only appears when the street dries. And when it does, it kind of interferes a little bit with the traffic use, creates some confusion. I seriously don't know how they allowed it to happen, but here it is.
That's a good one.
This is a picture by Nikolaus. And a few days before the opening, we were very surprised to see, or to be sent from Gwangju, that image. It was the teacher union that actually created their own protest in the Ramallah circle of this roundabout, sitting, blocking the road, sitting within that. Here you see them. I mean, it's hard to see. This is not the roundabout. They're sitting within that circle and initiating this protest. Second book.
I think we will keep the
We'll go
discussion
straight-
really short.
Well, we'll go straight to the audience, right?
Yeah. we
Yes,
can.
I think. If there are questions, which maybe there are. Emily?
So I wondered if you could go back to squares versus roundabouts a little bit, because and the way in which they become sites of obstruction or become almost blurred with each other and very generative. I'm thinking of Oto Maidan, where they created a kind of circle through traffic jams in Kiev and sort of created a new concept, which is adding the idea of cars to the square. So I just was thinking about, is there such a sharp division, maybe this would be the simple question, between the function of the square and its viral relationality to other spaces of demonstration and gathering versus the circle and the roundabout, which is this, as you say, it's an oppositional form.
But it's confusing because there are square roundabouts and there are circular squares, and I'm not just trying to be funny about it. A roundabout is it's a system of rules of self-regulation. It is that kind of liberalism in traffic form, and in the Maidan in Kiev is actually a square that is circular. However, the idea of taking over a roundabout is the idea of putting the city under siege by creating shock waves through acupuncture, right? You press one point, you create shock waves that travel and somehow paralyze a situation. You gather where you should not gather. The square is where they tell you to gather, even if the square is round. The roundabout is to enter into the kind of the forbidden zone and deactivate it, right?
Is that so, John?
Yes, hi. My question is very brief. It is actually fascinating that you are presenting two books tonight. My question is really about connection or disconnection between the two. Because it seems
not presenting.
right. Okay. So in fact, because it seems to me that the first book really shows something that it may be uncontrolled as force or as territorial crafting, and the second one as a control, even though by liberating forces of something on top of it. So, just my kind of question would be. How do you see these two being together and whether they could be on their own at any time possible.
I did not think of any connections between the books, except of the fact that I wrote them both on the same sabbatical year. I mean, they're so different. No, the first one is desperate, and the second one is kind of playful, more architectural. I think that the idea of things going out of control, falling out of control, and the way they fall out of control, the way in which design is kind of breaks apart, is perhaps something, with a push that one can say is related to both of them. If you think about climate as a political project of colonialism, climate change as a political project, it's a project that has gone out of control, right? And that is something that is very distinct about it. It is, there's a fight back, there's a pushback, there's a certain kind of collapse of order that maybe could be related to the second book, but again, it's a kind of stretch.
Yeah, I mean, this is it in full praise. I mean, it's not. I'm just curious about the strategy, whether one book leverages the other one by default, even though they may, happen at the same time during the same sabbatical. But I'm really curious whether you think that could be a way of pursuing this kind of work into things which open up, fascinating possibilities for research.
Yeah, I mean, in my work, forensic architecture occupies a certain bandwidth of my practice, and this is really as optimistic as the work of a pathologist could be. It's always too late. There's nothing you can do. By the time I'm there, it's too late. But the Roundabout Revolution somehow comes from another line of work that is to do with the office I run with Sandy Hilal and Alessandro Petti in Palestine, that somehow tries to use politics and architecture in a bit more optimistic way, right? We kind of created this sort of vision of a world in the West Bank in which everything becomes something else. No, everything that was designed for colonial purposes is inverted and transformed and used into something that it is not, a kind of an architecture of decolonization. This is why we call decolonizing architecture art residency in there. So I think those things occupy different bandwidth of my practice, and somehow the two extremes of working in politics and architecture. On the one hand, you need to be optimistic. You need to make projective projects that are literal in a way that they seek political change. The way in which the political kind of intervention of forensics is kind of more infrastructural, on a level of history, on a level of political struggle, on the level of affecting public opinion. So I don't think necessarily they need to be merged. I think that it's best to think about one's practice as an architect as existing across the spectrum.
In that sense, the second book might be a non-forensic book, or the non-forensic Weizman.
Yeah.
Because this is a bit going back to a question I had regarding the first book, regarding the relation between mapping and designing, where on the one hand, sometimes mapping or reconstructing feels as something very reactive to something given in a way. And whereas a design practice traditionally implies a very active role. And of course, it's not black and white as a distinction, but it seems to me that this is a kind of difference between these two approaches that you just described.
This is a kind of a very diagrammatic division, but it doesn't always operate like that. As I said, mapping opens up possibilities, mapping affects in as much as it documents. And I think something that is absolutely important in forensic architecture, something we increasingly trying to do, is to understand that the traditional forums of the law are never enough. Our claims need to be in excess of the law. And so, if you're traditional forensic experts in criminal cases, you operate within given sets of institutions. You operate by the protocol of the law, by the rules of evidence. The forum is prior to the evidence. But in political context, very often the forum would not exist. The forum would need to be constructed in order for a claim to be heard. And forensic architecture, in that sense, it's also a projective practice that seeks to conceive forums yet to come, right? I mean, forums to be assembled. One of the best attempt is in this project. No, when we created participated with Zohot in creating the Truth Commission, with its spaces, with the kind of forum that we thought to gather. So I think in forensic architecture, both architecture is the evidence, but there's also the architecture of the forum. You need to construct and assemble in order for evidence at all to enter into conditions of legibility. So it's not enough to do research, right? You need to do research, you need to construct a forum in which research would be performed.
Are there any other questions? If not, I just have a final off top of your head. So if the classic roundabout is the liberal subject, quickly, what would the roundabout for the neoliberal subject look like? Very quickly.
Oh, man.
Who has right of way?
This is
how do we go in and out of that?
That's the new issue of cabinet, I think.
Now let's map some wine over there.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.